There is a man sitting in a rented room in Rome. The year is AD 61. The room is not large. There is a window, probably, and light that comes and goes with the afternoon clouds and the sound of the city below. Carts on stone, vendors calling, the smell of bread and animals, and a million people living their lives without him. He is writing a letter. He has a chain on his wrist. The chain runs from his wrist to the wrist of a soldier sitting across from him. The soldier is young, most likely, probably bored. He has been assigned to guard this prisoner for a 4-hour rotation, and then another soldier will come, and that soldier will sit in this rented room and listen to this man dictate sentences in Greek to a secretary, and the words will be copied onto parchment and eventually rolled up and carried by foot across 500 miles of Roman road to a small city on the northeastern edge of Greece. The letter begins cheerfully, almost alarmingly so. It talks about joy. 16 times in 4 chapters, the man uses the word rejoice. He thanks the people he is writing to. He tells them he is praying for them. He says he wants them to be glad. He is a prisoner awaiting trial. The trial could go either way. The man knows this. He writes anyway. And then, near the end of the letter, he writes 2 verses that have outlasted the Roman Empire, outlasted every philosopher who tried to solve the same problem with reason alone, outlasted 2,000 years of human anxiety, and somehow, in the age of antidepressants and therapy apps and weighted blankets, these 2 sentences still work. Stay with me, because I want to show you exactly why. The verses are Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7. They read like this: "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." That is it. That is the whole thing. And if you have ever read those words in the middle of an anxious night and thought, "That sounds beautiful, but I have no idea what to actually do with it," this video is for you. Because the man who wrote it was not writing poetry. He was writing a prescription. And hidden inside the grammar of that prescription is a 4-step sequence that human neuroscience would not catch up to for almost 2,000 years. This is not a story about a verse. This is not a story about positive thinking. This is not a story about believing harder. This is a story about what actually happens inside the human brain when a frightened person does what Paul said, and why the peace that comes afterward is not the peace you manufactured. It is the peace that was posted there, like a guard. We are going to need to go back to Philippi. The city of Philippi sits in northern Greece, on the main Roman road between Europe and Asia. In Paul's day, it was a Roman colony, full of retired soldiers who had been granted land there, full of Latin speakers who kept Roman customs in a Greek-speaking world, full of people who were proud to be Roman citizens in a city far from Rome. Paul had been there before, a decade earlier, and his first visit had not gone smoothly. He arrived with a man named Silas, and within days he had cast a demon out of a slave girl whose fortune-telling had been making her owners a great deal of money. The owners were furious. They had Paul and Silas arrested, brought before the magistrates, stripped, beaten with rods, a public flogging in the marketplace in front of whoever was watching, and then thrown into the inner prison with their feet locked in the stocks. The stocks were a wooden frame that held your ankles apart, stretched at an unnatural angle. You could not lie down. You could not sit comfortably. You sat in the dark of the inner cell, the deepest, farthest cell from the door, in pain, with dried blood on your back from the rods, listening to the sounds of the prison. It was here, at midnight, that Paul and Silas began to sing, not quietly, loudly enough that the other prisoners, hardened men, criminals, men with nothing to lose, were listening. The Greek word Luke uses for their listening is epikrounto. It means to listen attentively. These men did not tell Paul to be quiet. They sat in the dark and they listened to a man with broken skin and locked feet sing to his God. And then the earthquake came. The foundations shook. Every door flew open. Every chain fell loose. the jailer. A retired soldier, most likely, the kind of man who would have been given this civic appointment in a Roman colony, woke from his sleep, saw the open doors, and drew his sword to kill himself. Under Roman law, a jailer who lost his prisoners paid for it with his life. He had already decided how this ended. And Paul, somehow, from across the dark room, saw him. "Do not harm yourself. We are all here." The jailer called for lights and ran in, trembling. And then he asked the question that the singing had already been answering all night long. "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" That night, the jailer and his entire household were baptized. The man who had put Paul's feet in the stocks washed Paul's wounds with his own hands before dawn. This is the city that Paul is writing to. A decade later, these are people who carry that story in their bodies. The earthquake, the singing, the chains falling off. The church at Philippi began in a midnight crisis. These are people who already know that something can happen in the dark that reason cannot explain. Here's what most people miss when they read Philippians. Before Paul writes, "Do not be anxious," he names two women. Their names are Euodia and Syntyche. They are prominent members of the Philippian church. Paul describes them as women who labored side by side with him in the gospel. They had been there from the beginning. They knew Lydia, the purple cloth merchant who had been Paul's first convert in Europe and who had opened her home as the city's first church. These were not peripheral figures. These were leaders. And they were in a conflict serious enough that Paul, writing from house arrest in Rome, had been briefed about it, probably by Epaphroditus, the church's messenger who had traveled 500 miles to bring Paul a financial gift and had nearly died of illness along the way. The conflict between Euodia and Syntyche had traveled 500 miles in Epaphroditus's report. It was that significant. Paul does not take sides. He does not say who is right. He addresses each woman separately, by name, with the same verb. "I urge Euodia, and I urge Syntyche, to agree in the Lord." Notice what comes 4 verses later. "Do not be anxious about anything." Paul is not writing this verse in the abstract. He is writing it to a church that has a real conflict between real people with real names, a conflict that has been going on long enough to reach Rome, a conflict that is fracturing the community he loves most. He is writing it to people whose anxiety is not hypothetical. It is relational. It is the kind of anxiety that sits between two people who once worked shoulder to shoulder and now cannot look at each other in the same room. The verse does not say, "Do not be anxious once you have resolved your conflict." It says, "In every situation." Now I want to show you something about the man who wrote this. Because one of the oldest mistakes people make with Philippians is to read it as if Paul were writing from a position of peace he had always possessed, as if anxiety was never something he knew. Read 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. Paul is listing his sufferings: shipwrecks, beatings, stonings, a night in the open sea, and then he adds one more. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. The Greek word he uses there is merimnao, the noun form of the same root as merimnao in Philippians 4. He is not borrowing a concept from someone else's experience. He is describing his own. Paul knew anxiety, not the vague, background hum of modern life, the daily pressure of it. The weight of knowing that in the churches he had planted, people were suffering, people were going astray, people were in conflict, and he was in chains 500 miles away and could do exactly nothing. And then there was Epaphroditus. This man had been sent by the Philippian church to bring Paul money and companionship during his imprisonment. He had made the journey across Greece and down the coast of the Adriatic and overland to Rome, weeks of travel. And somewhere along the way he had fallen so desperately ill that he nearly died. Paul writes about it openly in the letter. He was ill, near to death. But God had mercy on him. And not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow, sorrow upon sorrow. That is not the language of a man for whom anxiety is a distant problem. That is the language of a man who knows what it is to hold two fears at once: the fear of losing a friend and the fear of what that loss would mean for a church already under strain. Here's the part nobody tells you about Paul's prescription for anxiety. He wrote it while living inside the thing he was prescribing against. He was not writing from the other side. He was writing from the middle of it. And this matters, because when he tells you not to be anxious, he is not speaking from comfort. He is speaking from chains. Pay attention to this. The Greek word he uses for anxious, merimnao, comes from a root that means to be divided, to be pulled in two directions simultaneously, to be split against yourself. The medical writers of Paul's era used the same root to describe a fracture, a bone broken into two pieces that should have been one. Anxiety, in the Greek Paul was thinking in, is not primarily a feeling. It is a fracture of attention. It is what happens when the mind is trying to occupy two moments at once, the present moment and the feared future moment, and it cannot do it, and the effort of trying tears at the seams of the self. The German philosopher of the same century, Seneca, who was not German, who was in fact living in Rome at the same time Paul was writing from his rented room, had his own prescription for this problem. Seneca was the Stoic philosopher who had tutored the Emperor Nero in his youth. He was one of the most brilliant men alive, and he wrote, in his letters to his friend Lucilius, this observation: "We suffer more in imagination than in reality. There are more things that frighten us than injure us." It is a good observation. It is true. And for certain kinds of anxiety, the kind that is purely imaginary, the kind that dissolves when exposed to reason, Seneca's prescription works. But Seneca died in AD 65. Nero ordered him to commit suicide. The philosophy of reason held him up well. Accounts say he met his end with composure. And yet, the next crisis always comes. And reason, however brilliant, has a ceiling. It can quiet the thought, but it cannot guard the room. Paul's prescription works differently. And to understand why, you need to look carefully at the structure of what he actually says. Do not be anxious about anything. This is the command. But Paul does not stop there. He does not say feel free to feel whatever you feel, or pretend the anxiety does not exist, or muster your faith and push it away. He gives the anxious person something specific to do, something structured, something with 4 distinct parts. The first part is proseuche, the Greek word translated as prayer. This is not the word for a request. This is the word for general communion with God. It implies presence, coming into a room and being with someone, not immediately asking for something, but acknowledging who is there. The relationship before the request. The second part is deesis, the Greek word translated as petition. This is where specificity arrives. Deesis means to make a specific request for a specific need, not prayer in general, a named thing, the actual fear, the thing you have been carrying. You set it down here, by name, before God. The third part, and this is where the prescription becomes counterintuitive, is eucharistia, thanksgiving. Before you have received anything, before the anxiety has been resolved, before the outcome has been determined, you give thanks for what has already been given, even while the present danger has not passed. This is not gratitude as a feeling. This is gratitude as an act, a deliberate reorientation of the attention from what you do not yet have to what you already hold. And the fourth part is to present your requests to God. The same anxiety, the same fear, the same named thing, but placed now in the hands of someone who is not you. Here's what most people miss about this sequence. Neuroscience did not exist when Paul wrote it. There were no fMRI machines. There was no concept of the default mode network, the system of brain regions that modern researchers have identified as the engine of rumination. But when you read the neuroscience of anxiety and you compare it to Paul's 4-step sequence, something remarkable emerges. The default mode network is your brain's background operating system. It is the neural circuitry that activates when you have nothing specific to focus on, when you are not engaged with a task, when your mind is left without an anchor. Modern research has linked overactivity in this network directly to rumination, the repetitive, involuntary cycling of anxious thoughts that characterizes anxiety and depression. When the default mode network is running without direction, the mind does what merimnao describes. It divides, it fractures, it loops. What breaks the loop is focused attention, not just any attention. Structured, directed, purposeful attention. The kind of attention that has an object, a specific thing to focus on, and that moves through a sequence so the mind does not drift, which is exactly what Paul's prescription is. The first step, proseuche, breaks the isolation of the anxious mind by establishing contact with something outside itself. The second step, deesis, forces specificity. The brain must name the thing, which pulls it out of the vague dread of the imagined future and into the concrete present. The third step, eucharistia, is a deliberate redirection of attention from what is feared to what is known, which is what researchers call cognitive reappraisal, the process by which the prefrontal cortex overrides the amygdala's threat signal by introducing competing information. And the fourth step, presenting the request to God, transfers the weight of the outcome to someone other than the anxious self. Paul did not know any of this in those terms. He knew it the way a craftsman knows the tool that works, not because he has read the manual, but because he has used it in the dark. Now watch what happens next. After the prescription, Paul does not say, "And then your problem will be resolved." He does not say, "And then the anxiety will never return." He says, "And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." The word translated guard is phroureō. This is a military term. Specific, technical, Roman. It means to garrison a location, to post soldiers at the gate, to station a guard unit whose sole purpose is to prevent unauthorized entry. Paul was chained to a Roman soldier when he wrote this word. He looked at the man who had been assigned to prevent his escape, and he used that man's job description as the metaphor for what God's peace does to the human mind. The guard is not you. The guard is not your willpower or your positive thinking or your ability to reason your way back from the edge. The guard is stationed there by God's peace, a peace that, Paul says, transcends all understanding, meaning a peace that does not require the situation to be resolved first, a peace that is present before the outcome is known. This is the thing that Seneca's philosophy could not produce. Reason can produce a peace that depends on a satisfactory conclusion. The Stoic learns to be indifferent to outcome, which is a form of peace, but it is achieved by caring less. What Paul describes is different. It is a peace that cares fully and is guarded nonetheless. Let me take you back to the rented room. The soldier is still there, chain on his wrist, Paul dictating in Greek. Outside, Rome is doing what Rome always does: eating, fighting, building, collapsing, spending money it doesn't have on bread and circuses for a population growing too large and too restless to ignore. The soldier has been listening. He has been listening for 4 hours a day, 6 days at a time, rotating out with 5 other men who have also been listening, all of them stationed at the wrist of this small, scarred man who will not stop talking about his God. Philippians chapter 1, verse 13. My imprisonment has become known throughout the whole palace guard. The whole palace guard. This was Rome's elite regiment. 9,000 men, selected specifically for their fitness and loyalty. They guarded the emperor. They lived together in the fortress barracks on the edge of the city. When they went home at the end of a rotation, they told stories in the mess. And what they told, the thing that spread through the barracks like something strange that had never been there before, was what they had heard in a rented room near the river. A man in chains, writing about joy. Some of them believed. We know this because near the end of Philippians, Paul sends greetings from the saints who are in Caesar's household, not Nero's relatives. The term means the network of staff and servants and soldiers connected to the imperial palace. The gospel had moved from the rented room, through the chain on Paul's wrist, through the barracks, all the way into the machinery of Caesar. The men sent to prevent Paul's influence became the conduit for it. Here's the part that still stops me. The word Paul uses for what God's peace does to the heart and mind, phroureō, to garrison, to guard, is the exact same category of action being performed by the soldiers rotating through his room. The Roman Empire assigned human guards to contain a prisoner. Paul uses that institution, that specific Roman practice, that man sitting across from him with a chain on his wrist, as the image of what happens when someone brings their anxiety to God through the four-step sequence. The guard becomes the sermon. The chain becomes the theology. Everything that was meant to silence him, he turned into a word picture of the peace that was keeping him. And this is where I want to talk to you directly, because what you are anxious about may not be resolved. Not soon. Maybe not ever in the way you want. The business may not recover. The diagnosis may not change. The relationship may not be repaired. Paul was not writing to people whose problems were about to disappear. He was writing to Euodia and Syntyche, who still had to work out how to be in the same room together. He was writing to a church that was sending support to a man who might be executed. He was writing to Epaphroditus, who had nearly died doing the right thing and would carry that experience in his body for the rest of his life. This is not a verse that promises a solution. This is not a verse that tells you the anxiety was wrong to come. This is not a verse that measures your faith by the absence of fear. This is a verse that tells you that if you bring the anxiety, the specific, named real anxiety, through a specific sequence of prayer, petition, and thanksgiving, what will be stationed on the other side of that act is a peace that does not require the resolution of the problem to exist, a peace that transcends all understanding, not the peace you thought your way into, not the peace you talked yourself down from the ledge toward, a peace that cannot be fully explained by circumstances because it is present before the circumstances have changed. You've heard of the default mode network, the brain's worry circuit. What modern neuroscience tells us is that the only thing that consistently interrupts it is not willpower and not reasoning it into silence, but structured, purposeful attention directed outward towards something real. The brain needs an anchor, and when it finds one, the loop breaks. For 2,000 years, without knowing the neuroscience, Christians have been doing exactly that: structured, directed, thankful prayer, and reporting the same result Paul describes. Not always resolution, sometimes resolution, but almost always a peace that arrived without their manufacture and stayed without their maintenance. Not the peace of answered prayer, the peace of the guard at the gate. 3 things, and then we are done. The first, Philippians 4, 6, and 7 is not a feeling you are supposed to have. It is a sequence you are supposed to do. Prayer, relationship before request. Petition, specificity, name the thing. Thanksgiving, deliberate reorientation before the answer arrives. Request, bring the actual fear and place it in hands that are not yours. The peace is the outcome of the sequence. You do not manufacture the peace. You do the sequence. The peace is the garrison that arrives after. The second, the man who wrote this verse was anxious. He said so. He carried the daily pressure of concern for people he loved and could not reach. He worried about Epaphroditus. He carried the weight of Euodia and Syntyche's conflict 500 miles away. He was chained to a soldier in a rented room waiting for a trial that could end in his execution. If this verse was a command to never feel anxious, Paul broke his own command before the ink was dry. What the verse commands is not the elimination of anxiety, but the direction of it. Give it somewhere to go. Give it the 4-step path, and let what comes back be what God sends. The third, there is a soldier in that rented room who came to contain a man and went home having heard the most anti-anxiety teaching ever written. He did not come looking for it. He was assigned to it. His presence in that room was meant to be the obstacle, but the obstacle became the audience. And somehow the word that described his job, phroureō, to guard, became the word for what God's peace does to every human mind that is willing to bring its fear to the 4-step altar and leave it there. Paul wrote this in chains. He had no peace in his circumstances. He had all the peace he needed in his God. Which verse in this letter hit you hardest today? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one. And if what you heard today is something you needed, share it with someone who is in the middle of an anxious night. Not as advice, as company. Because that is what this letter was. A man in a rented room, chained and writing, sending 500 miles of company to people who were afraid. He has been sending it ever since.